The sharp crack of breaking glass jolted Emily into the present, her chest tightening as if the world itself had torn open. Emily said, "Why does it always feel like I am breaking even when no one notices?" Her voice shook, but her eyes burned with suppressed rage. The office floor was silent, except for the humming fluorescent light above, cold and unfeeling. She stared at the shattered coffee mug on the tiles, watching the dark liquid spread like a wound that refused to heal. Emily thought of every time she was overlooked, each dismissal by her superiors, and the constant whisper of her own doubt. Yet even in this moment of chaos, something stirred inside her, a spark that whispered she could not remain invisible forever. The colleague across the room, Daniel, glanced at her, his brow furrowed, but his voice calm as he said, "Maybe it's time you stopped hiding, Emily." His words struck harder than the shatter, leaving her trembling. Emily carried the weight of silence as she sat back at her desk, the broken mug now just a stain on the floor. She whispered, "They never even hear me unless I'm breaking." Her words dissolved into the hum of computers. Daniel's chair creaked as he leaned back, his voice blunt yet steady as he said, "Maybe that's because you let them ignore you." She flinched, anger rising in her chest, but beneath it lingered the truth. For years she had blended into the background, never speaking too loudly, never stepping forward when it mattered. Her colleagues passed by daily, nodding, offering shallow greetings, but never truly seeing her. Emily clenched her jaw, her hand curling into a fist on the desk, knowing Daniel's words were the harsh truth she avoided for too long. The screens cast a sterile glow across Emily's face as she typed, each keystroke echoing like a cry for recognition. She thought of every time she had delivered results only to have her work credited to someone louder, bolder, or simply more favored. Emily said, "I am not invisible. I cannot keep being erased." The words felt fragile but fierce, a whisper of rebellion. Daniel swiveled his chair, his voice edged with sarcasm as he replied, "Then stop acting like a ghost, Emily." She froze at his words, her chest rising and falling as frustration grew stronger. The urge to scream battled with the fear of being dismissed once more. Yet the fire in her chest no longer felt like a burden but like fuel. Emily pressed her palms flat against the desk, the cool surface grounding her. Memories of her childhood flashed, the quiet girl in the corner, listening but never daring to speak. Emily said, "I have swallowed silence my whole life." Her voice was steady now, not a whisper, but not yet loud enough to shake walls. Daniel narrowed his eyes, his tone more cutting than kind as he said, "And what has that silence bought you?" His words pierced, leaving her staring at her trembling hands. She remembered every slight, every dismissal, every shadow where she had hidden. But in the pit of her stomach grew a knot of defiance, tight and unyielding. Emily inhaled slowly, her lungs filling with a new kind of air, one that carried resolve instead of doubt. The silence stretched as Emily rose to her feet, no longer crouched, no longer small. She said, "I am tired of being silent, tired of being unseen." The words shook slightly, but they were hers, and they filled the office like a declaration. Daniel's expression softened for the first time, his voice quiet but firm as he replied, "Then prove it." His words were not cruel this time, but a challenge wrapped in respect. Emily straightened her back, meeting his eyes without flinching. She felt the weight of years lift just enough for her to breathe more freely. The broken mug was still there, shards glinting on the floor, but now it looked less like a wound and more like a beginning. She knew the path would be hard, but for the first time, she wanted to walk it. The next morning, Emily sat at her cubicle, staring at her inbox filled with messages that overlooked her contributions yet again. She whispered, "They take my work and give my silence in return." Her stomach clenched as her supervisor's email praised another team member for ideas that had been hers. Daniel walked past, catching the flicker of frustration on her face. He said, "Are you going to keep letting them steal from you, Emily?" His bluntness stung, but it forced her eyes upward, meeting his without retreat. Emily's heart pounded, each beat echoing the question he posed. She thought of her mother's voice, telling her to stay humble, to survive quietly. But humility had become chains, and she could feel them cutting into her skin. Emily scrolled through the presentation slides, each one marked with edits that stripped away her vision. Her chest tightened as she saw her name missing from the final credits. She muttered, "Erased again." Daniel leaned on the partition wall of her cubicle, his tone sharp as he said, "Then speak before they erase you completely." She clenched her jaw, knowing he was right, but fear clawed inside her. The memory of every scoff, every rolled eye from colleagues, rose like ghosts around her. Emily thought of her father, reminding her to work hard and wait her turn, but waiting had cost her years. She exhaled, feeling the weight of resignation and defiance collide in her chest. Emily walked into the break room, her steps heavy as whispers swirled from two colleagues gossiping near the coffee machine. One said loudly enough for her to hear, "She's good at doing the work, not leading it." Heat rushed to her cheeks, her throat tightening. She turned away, gripping her notebook like a shield. Daniel entered moments later, catching her rigid stance. He said, "You let them decide your worth every time you stay quiet." Emily swallowed hard, unable to deny the truth. Her mind replayed years of laughter behind her back, the way even small victories were overshadowed. She tightened her grip on the notebook, her nails pressing into the cover as if anchoring herself. Emily sat outside the office on a concrete bench, the autumn wind biting against her face. She whispered, "Maybe I am not meant for more than this." Her voice trembled, carried away by the breeze. Daniel sat down beside her, not looking at her, his tone blunt as he said, "Or maybe you're just afraid of failing when you finally try." The words landed like stones, but beneath the sting was a spark. Emily stared at the falling leaves, each one spinning before hitting the ground, fragile yet free. She closed her eyes, inhaling cold air, and for a moment imagined herself breaking the cycle, standing where no one could dismiss her again. The thought frightened and exhilarated her. Back at her desk, Emily opened a blank document, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Her heart thudded, fear telling her to remain silent, while another voice whispered to speak. She said softly, "This time, I will put my name on it." Her words felt fragile, but real. Daniel paused at her cubicle, his tone calmer now as he said, "Good, make them see you." The hum of the office surrounded her, but she no longer felt entirely drowned in it. She began typing, each keystroke like a heartbeat, steady and insistent. For the first time, the page carried her voice without disguise, and though her chest still tightened, it also carried relief. The office lights dimmed late into the evening, leaving only a few glowing screens across the floor. Emily's head throbbed as she stared at the rejected draft on her screen. She whispered, "Why do I keep trying when no one wants to listen?" Her words sank into the hum of silence. Daniel walked by, his steps slow as he glanced at her desk. He said, "Because deep down you know you can't stop." His tone was flat, but his eyes betrayed recognition of her fatigue. Emily clenched her jaw, remembering every night she stayed behind while others walked free, her sacrifices swallowed by indifference. The ache inside her was no longer quiet despair, but a gnawing rage she struggled to control. Emily rubbed her temples, the memory of her boss dismissing her idea replaying again and again. He had said, "Not convincing enough," while another coworker repeated the same idea minutes later and earned praise. She muttered, "Invisible until someone steals my voice." Daniel leaned against her cubicle wall, his voice dry as he said, "Then shout until they can't ignore you." Emily's chest tightened, fear and fury warring inside. She wanted to fight, yet the thought of standing in front of them sent her pulse racing. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her notebook, pressing her pen to the page as if carving her anger into words. The next meeting room buzzed with chatter, voices filling the air like a swarm. Emily sat in silence at the table's edge, watching her ideas vanish into louder mouths. Her heart pounded as her manager nodded at another colleague, ignoring her notes. Emily whispered to herself, "I am drowning in their noise." Daniel, seated across, caught her eye. He said quietly, "Then make them hear your storm." His challenge lingered in her chest as she gripped her pen tighter. Every instinct told her to stay silent, but the fury rising within felt stronger than the fear. She shifted in her chair, a tremor in her hands betraying her battle. Emily left the meeting trembling, the hallways echoing with voices that felt sharper than blades. She leaned against the wall, whispering, "Why am I always the shadow in their story?" Her voice cracked as anger swirled with shame. Daniel followed behind, his tone sharper now as he said, "Because you've chosen to stay in the shadows, Emily." His words cut deeper than the silence she endured. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, clenching her fists at her sides. She hated him for being right, for holding up a mirror she could not ignore. The walls seemed to close in, but somewhere within her, the fire refused to die. Alone in the restroom, Emily stared at her reflection, the harsh light above making every line of exhaustion clearer. She said to herself, "I am breaking, but I will not stay broken." The words echoed, unfamiliar yet empowering. She touched the mirror, her hand trembling, but in her eyes she caught a spark she had not seen before. Daniel's voice replayed in her memory, his blunt challenges, his insistence that silence was her prison. She inhaled slowly, feeling the fire spread through her chest. For the first time, the woman staring back was not only tired, but also unyielding. Emily whispered, "This is not the end of me." The rain tapped against the office windows as Emily sat frozen, replaying the meeting where her voice had once again gone unheard. She whispered, "It feels like I am invisible even when I scream inside." Daniel approached, his tone steady but edged with impatience as he said, "That's because screaming in your head doesn't move the world." His bluntness burned, yet Emily felt its weight. She turned to face him, frustration cutting through her hesitation. She wanted to fight back, to defend herself, but no words came. Her silence betrayed her again, and she clenched her jaw in shame. Yet beneath the sting, she knew his words carried the truth she had long avoided. Emily leaned back in her chair, arms crossed as she stared at the ceiling, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. She said, "What if I fail? What if I stand up and all they do is laugh?" Her voice cracked, heavier than she intended. Daniel leaned against the desk, his eyes steady as he replied, "Then at least you fail on your own terms, not theirs." The words landed hard, almost cruel, but they stripped away the excuse she held onto. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her chest rising with shallow breath. She wanted to reject his reasoning, but the bitter truth clung to her. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker of defiance stirred, faint but alive. Emily walked toward the elevator, her footsteps heavy, mind clouded with doubts. She muttered, "It's easier to keep my head down than risk being broken again." Daniel followed, his voice firm and cutting as he said, "Easier doesn't make you free." His words echoed through the sterile hallway, sharper than the metallic hum around them. Emily froze mid-step, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She hated the sting of his honesty, but it pressed against something buried within her. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowed, her fear clashing with the fire she could no longer ignore. The silence stretched, charged with defiance and doubt colliding inside her chest. Emily sat alone in the break room, staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee. She whispered, "Every time I try, the fear wins before I open my mouth." Daniel entered quietly, leaning on the counter, his voice flat as he said, "Fear wins because you hand it the victory." His words cut like steel, but his eyes softened for the first time. Emily looked at him, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the cup. She wanted to argue to reject his harshness, but the compassion behind his tone unsettled her more than the sharpness. Her chest tightened, her defenses lowering against her will. She realized his challenge was not cruelty, it was belief she struggled to accept. Emily returned to her desk, her reflection faint in the black screen of her monitor. She said softly, "I don't even know if I am strong enough to change this." The words hung heavy, fragile, but real. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed, his voice lower now but steady as he said, "Strength doesn't appear, it's built the moment you stop running." His gaze lingered on her, not with pity but with challenge. Emily inhaled sharply, her chest tightening as the words pressed against her doubts. She had never seen herself as strong, but his relentless honesty carved through the walls she built. For the first time, she dared to imagine standing without apology. The office buzzed with restless energy as the new project briefing began, voices clashing like waves. Emily sat rigid, flipping through the document, her breath catching when she noticed entire sections written by her had been credited to someone else. She whispered, "They erased me again." The sting in her chest felt sharper than ever. Daniel, seated nearby, leaned closer, his voice low but cutting as he said, "This isn't just oversight, Emily. Someone wanted your work stolen." The words struck like lightning, her pulse racing. She gripped the folder tightly, anger boiling as betrayal settled deep. Every whisper she had ignored, every quiet dismissal, now reshaped into a deliberate wound. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages again, each line she recognized twisted with another name at the top. She said softly, "They took everything, even my chance to be seen." Daniel straightened in his chair, his tone edged with fire as he said, "Then don't let them walk away with it." His words sparked fury inside her chest, stronger than fear. She thought of every night spent rewriting, every ounce of effort erased in one stroke. Her throat tightened, but her rage outweighed her doubt. For the first time, she felt betrayal not as weakness, but as proof she had something worth stealing. After the meeting, Emily stormed into the empty hallway, her breaths quick and shallow. She pressed the folder against her chest, whispering, "They used me, and I let them." Daniel followed close behind, his voice steadier now as he said, "You let them because you never claimed your voice. Now you know the cost." His words echoed through the corridor, heavy but true. Emily's chest heaved, fury and shame twisting together. Yet within that storm, she felt something else, a strange clarity. She realized that silence had not protected her. It had invited betrayal. Her heart pounded, but her spine straightened as the truth carved a new resolve within her. Emily entered the restroom, gripping the sink as if holding herself steady. She stared at the mirror, her voice breaking as she said, "They didn't just take my work, they took my name." Her reflection trembled in her vision, but the fire in her chest roared louder. Daniel's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that fear wins when handed victory. She exhaled sharply, her breath fogging the mirror, then straightened, meeting her own eyes with a fierceness that startled her. For the first time, she saw not a shadow, but a woman wronged, and a woman who could fight. The revelation shook her, yet it also ignited a storm she could not silence. Later that evening, Emily sat at her desk alone, the office empty and silent. The stolen credit still burned like an open wound, but now it sharpened her resolve. She whispered, "If they will not give me my voice, I will take it." Daniel's words replayed in her head, not as a wound, but as a push. She opened her laptop, typing with ferocity, her name in bold on the first line. Each keystroke was no longer a plea for recognition, but a claim. The betrayal had hurt, but it also revealed the truth. She had always been more powerful than her silence. And now, for the first time, she was ready to prove it. The boardroom was silent, except for the rustle of papers as Emily walked in, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. Every seat was filled, her superiors looking down at her with practiced indifference. She whispered to herself, "Do not let them erase you again." The air felt heavy as the memory of stolen credit gnawed at her, threatening to silence her before she spoke. But the fire in her chest burned hotter than fear. Daniel sat near the back, his gaze steady, arms crossed as if daring her to retreat. Emily placed her folder on the table, her fingers trembling before curling into fists. She inhaled deeply, straightening her spine. Her voice shook as she began, "This project, every word, every calculation, came from my hands." The room shifted, a murmur passing through, but Emily held firm. For the first time, she looked directly at the faces that had ignored her for years. She said, "I will not stand by while my name is stolen again." The tremor in her voice steadied, iron hardening her words. Daniel's subtle nod anchored her as silence spread across the room, no longer a silence of dismissal, but one charged with her defiance. Emily's words echoed through the room, her pulse racing as the silence grew heavier. One executive leaned back, lips curling into a faint smirk as he said, "Strong accusations for someone with little experience." Her stomach twisted, but she held her ground. Emily replied, "Experience is earned, but theft is chosen." The sharpness in her tone startled even herself. She remembered every dismissal, every slight, each moment she had swallowed her anger to survive, and she refused to shrink again. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his nod almost imperceptible, but it reminded her she wasn't alone in this battle. Another superior cleared her throat, attempting to dismiss the confrontation with a wave, but Emily pressed forward, her voice steady. "If my work was worth stealing, then it proves its value, and I demand my name be tied to it." The boldness of her words sent a ripple through the room. Fear clawed at her ribs, but her voice no longer faltered. She realized that even if they laughed, even if they dismissed her again, she had already won, because this time she had spoken. The room grew restless, voices rising as if to drown her out. Emily's palms pressed against the table, grounding herself as arguments clashed around her. One superior said sharply, "This is not how we conduct ourselves here." Her chest tightened, the familiar sting of being silenced creeping back. But Daniel's voice cut through the noise, calm yet firm. "She's telling the truth. I've watched her work, and it's hers." Emily froze at his unexpected defense, her eyes flicking toward him. For years she had fought in shadows, but here someone stood beside her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, then raised her voice above the chaos. "I am done letting silence steal from me. You can dismiss me, you can deny me, but my work speaks louder than your excuses." The room fell into uneasy quiet. For a moment, Emily felt her legs tremble, but her spine held straight. The storm inside her had finally broken free, no longer hidden but roaring for all to hear. Emily's chest rose and fell as she locked eyes with the executive at the center of the table, the one who had signed off on the stolen credit. He adjusted his tie, voice cold as he said, "You're making dangerous claims." Her pulse quickened, but she leaned closer, her voice like steel. "The danger was believing you could silence me forever." The words startled even her as they filled the sterile air. The man's jaw tightened, his mask of control slipping. Emily felt her hands shaking, but refused to lower them from the table. She thought of her childhood, of every time she blended into the background, and realized she was finally breaking free. Daniel's eyes met hers across the room, steady and grounding. She whispered to herself, "This is who I am now." The room shifted again, the once dismissive silence replaced by the weight of her defiance. She no longer felt like a shadow. She was the storm they had tried to ignore, and now they had no choice but to face it. The tension in the room pulsed like electricity, every eye fixed on Emily as if waiting for her to collapse under the weight of her own defiance. But she didn't falter. She stood taller, her voice rising with the force of years unspoken. "I will not vanish into your silence. My work, my name, my voice, it is mine, and I will claim it." The words slammed into the walls, reverberating like thunder. The executives shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes. Daniel unfolded his arms, his nod small but filled with respect. Emily felt her fear transform into fire, each breath steadier, stronger. For the first time, she saw herself not as the quiet girl in the corner, but as a force they could no longer dismiss. The broken mug, the countless stolen moments, the years of invisibility, they had brought her here, and now they became her strength. She whispered, almost to herself but loud enough for all to hear, "I am not your shadow anymore." Silence followed, but this silence was hers. The boardroom slowly emptied, chairs scraping against the polished floor as silence lingered in Emily's wake. She remained standing, her pulse still racing, but her voice echoing in her memory like a victory cry. Daniel passed her on his way out, his voice quieter than usual as he said, "You did what I knew you could." For once, his tone carried no edge, only recognition. Emily exhaled, her body trembling, but not from fear. This time, it was release. She looked down at her hands, steady now, no longer clenching in shame, but resting open on the table. The ghosts of silence that once haunted her had been replaced with something she had thought impossible: strength. Later that evening, Emily walked through the quiet city streets, neon lights glowing against the rain-slick pavement. She whispered, "The world feels different tonight." Each step echoed in the emptiness, but instead of loneliness, she felt a new belonging within herself. She no longer measured her worth through others' eyes. For the first time, she carried her name like armor, not a plea. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also freed her. Daniel's blunt words played in her memory, no longer as wounds but as the steady hand that had forced her forward. The fear was not gone, but it no longer owned her. The next morning, Emily sat at her desk, the office alive with the same old hum of screens and voices. Yet everything felt altered. She opened a new document, typing her name in bold at the top, a small act that now carried the weight of revolution. Daniel stopped at her cubicle, his tone neutral but his eyes steady as he said, "Keep going." She nodded, meeting his gaze without hesitation. It wasn't approval she sought anymore, but recognition of her own courage. She smiled faintly, realizing the silence around her no longer held her prisoner. It was space she now filled with her own presence. During lunch, Emily stepped outside, the autumn wind carrying golden leaves across the courtyard. She whispered, "I am not who I was yesterday." The weight of the past still pressed against her, but it no longer defined her. She watched others walk past, their voices loud, their presence certain, and for the first time she did not feel lesser in their shadow. She thought of the years spent hiding, of the quiet girl who had learned survival by silence. That girl was gone now. In her place stood someone who knew the cost of fear and had chosen to rise anyway. The path ahead would not be easy, but she finally felt ready to walk it. That night, Emily stood before her mirror once again, but the reflection staring back no longer felt like a stranger. She whispered, "This is who I was meant to be." The quiet girl who had once blended into shadows now met her gaze with steady eyes, no longer afraid of being seen. Daniel's voice echoed faintly in her memory, sharp, unrelenting, but always pushing her toward this moment. She smiled faintly, a mix of pain and triumph etched across her face. The journey was unfinished, but she no longer doubted her ability to walk it. With one final breath, she turned away from the mirror, stepping into the night beyond her room, carrying with her a strength no one could erase.